Hi there, I'm Dark Purple Unicorn. I've been reading a few comments on social media about the combat in the Callisto Protocol, which aren't particularly positive. If you're on the fence about whether this combat style could work for you, I've put together this video which shows the fighting in a few different scenarios. Who knows, maybe it'll help you make up your mind. I won't be including any major plot spoilers in the gameplay footage, but of course, it will reveal some of the enemies you'll face. Finally, a little heads up, some of the footage is pretty gruesome. My first impression was that it's an involved fighting style. Sometimes the action has a hyper-realistic quality. Fights feel immersive and require you to watch your opponent carefully, anticipating their next move as well as planning yours. I don't think you can really get away without learning how to dodge, although it's not a difficult maneuver. There's no real timing involved, just alternate left and right on the left directional stick. Something else that sprang to mind straight away were the immediate similarities between the Callisto Protocol and Dead Space. For example, the health system, stomping on dead enemies to reveal inventory items, and the gruesome death scenes at the hands of mutated monstrosities. So, yes, there are similarities, but there's also something unique about the combat. You start out with only a melee weapon. Patience is needed here. You can't just wallop your enemy into submission by hitting them repeatedly, especially when there's more than one of them. You have to time your hits and dodges. You can also use stealth attacks to your advantage to reduce the number of enemies you face at once. You do get firearms to use against your foes, but again, you need to be tactical in how you use your ammunition. You don't have overwhelming firepower from the get-go, although you can upgrade weapons later. I found that using a combination of the dodge, block, melee, stealth, and firearms has meant that I haven't needed to use health injectors excessively. Next, we get a weapon to add to the mix that feels like a fusion of the kinesis and stasis modules in Dead Space. You obtain an attachment on your arm called the GRP, or Gravity Restraint Projector, which you can use to pick up enemies, freezing their movement when you do. Then, you're free to throw them into environmental hazards and cause them a brutal death. You can also use the GRP to pick up objects to hurl at enemies. If you've played Dead Space, you'll be familiar with this style of strategizing between a growing array of weapons. Of course, this approach isn't unique to Dead Space or the Callisto Protocol, but the particular mix of weapons you use does have its own distinct flavour. I think some people might find it a little tedious that you can rarely shoot your way through a horde of enemies, and that instead you need to use the full lineup of weapons to progress. However, I think it presents a more realistic challenge and helps to maintain that constant underlying feeling of unease as you enter each encounter. I feel that having to think carefully about when you can afford to use bullets and when you can save them by using melee weapons or the GRP adds to immersion in the survival horror experience. I love that the Callisto Protocol has that same ability to build tension and fear as in the first Dead Space game, and I think the combat plays a role in enhancing this. If you're looking for a basic shooter, this isn't it. If you try to go against the grain of what the game's offering and turn it into one, I think you'll be disappointed. But if you embrace the combat style for what it is, I do think you can have a lot of fun. Even then, it's still not going to be everyone's cup of tea. Survival horror is my favourite genre, and Dead Space is one of my favourite games. So for me, a game that, to a certain extent, emulates that style, but with more modern mechanics, means that I'm really enjoying this element of the Callisto Protocol.